Hello there. Tonight we are going to the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union in the winter of 1959 to spend time with 9 young people who set out on a ski trek through one of the most remote and unforgiving landscapes in the world, and who, on the night of February the 1st, did something that no experienced mountaineer would ever do voluntarily. They cut their way out of their tent from the inside in temperatures of -30 degrees without their boots, without their proper clothing, and walked out into the dark and the snow and the wind and never came back. The Soviet investigation that followed concluded that the group had been killed by an unknown compelling force, a phrase so strange and so deliberately vague that it has haunted this case for 65 years. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and like the video, and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Now let's begin. To understand what happened on the night of February 1st, 1959, on the eastern slope of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kholatsyakhl, which translates with an unnerving appropriateness as Dead Mountain, you need to understand who these 9 people were. They were not amateurs. They were not the kind of people who make fatal mistakes from ignorance or carelessness. They were experienced, well-trained, physically capable young adults at the peak of their outdoor skills. And the fact that something caused all 9 of them to die is therefore not just a tragedy but a genuine mystery, because the explanation that would cover most mountain deaths, inexperience, poor judgment, inadequate preparation, does not apply here. These were exactly the kind of people who should have survived. Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov was 23 years old, a 5th-year student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, studying radio engineering. He was, by all accounts, one of the most capable outdoor enthusiasts of his generation at the institute, a young man who had been leading hiking and skiing expeditions since his mid-teens and who had a reputation for meticulous preparation and genuine technical skill. He was the kind of person who built things. He had constructed his own shortwave radio equipment from components, and he brought that radio on this expedition so that the group could communicate their progress to the Institute's sports club back in Sverdlovsk. He was not charismatic in the obvious way, not a natural performer, but he commanded the respect of his peers through quiet competence, and the group that assembled around him for this particular expedition had done so because of his reputation. He was their leader, and he earned that role. Zinaida Alexeyevna Kolmogorova, Zina to everyone who knew her, was 22, also a student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, studying radio engineering alongside Dyatlov in the same department. She was one of 2 women on the expedition, and she was, by all accounts, a person of considerable force of personality, warm, sociable, physically strong, and deeply committed to the outdoor life that defined the social world of the Institute's hiking and skiing club. She kept a diary throughout the expedition, and the entries she made in the days before the final night are among the most important documents the case has produced, not because they contain any obvious clues, but because they give us the texture of the group's daily experience with an intimacy that no official record can replicate. Her last entry, written on the final day of January, describes the group in good spirits, mentions the wind picking up, and notes that they are behind schedule and planning to push further before making camp. Lyudmila Alexandrovna Dubinina was 21, a 3rd-year student studying engineering economics. She was the youngest woman on the expedition and one of the most physically vigorous members of the group, described by people who knew her as someone who threw herself into outdoor activity with a kind of joyful aggression, who did not manage hardship stoically but seemed genuinely to enjoy it. She had been on multiple previous expeditions and had the kind of experience that the hiking club recognized formally. She held a Category 2 mountaineering qualification, which in the Soviet sports classification system meant she had completed a defined set of demanding routes and been assessed as capable. She will become In the investigation that follows the expedition's disappearance, one of the most discussed of the 9 victims, because what was found with her body was among the most disturbing details of the entire case. Rustem Vladimirovich Slobodin was 23, an engineer who had already graduated from the institute and was working at a closed military facility called Sverdlovsk 44, one of the many closed cities of the Soviet nuclear complex, where he worked in what the records describe generically as a technical capacity. He was one of the most experienced skiers in the group, and he was known for a kind of quiet, steady reliability that made him valuable on expeditions where morale and physical consistency mattered as much as technical skill. When his body was found, the medical examiner noted a hairline fracture of the skull, a detail that has generated significant debate ever since, because the fracture was not large enough, in the examiner's opinion, to have caused death by itself, and the cause of death was recorded as hypothermia. The question of how a hairline skull fracture occurs in a person who subsequently walks several hundred meters through deep snow before dying of cold has never been satisfactorily answered. Yuri Nikolaevich Doroshenko was 21, a student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in the Faculty of Radiotechnology. He was physically large and strong, described by his contemporaries as powerful, someone whose contribution to the group was partly the brute physical capacity to break trail through deep snow and carry heavy loads without complaint. He had been in a relationship with Zina Kolmogorova at some point before the expedition, though the relationship had ended, and the question of whether any residual personal tension existed between them within the group's dynamics is one of the small, unanswerable human details that the historical record preserves without resolving. Yuri Alexeyevich Krivonishenko was 23, a graduate engineer who, like Slobodin, was already working rather than studying. He worked at Chelyabinsk 40, another closed city in the Soviet nuclear complex, at a facility called Mayak that had been the site of a catastrophic nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster, which had contaminated a large area of the southern Urals with radioactive material and which was, at the time of the Dyatlov expedition, still officially secret. The significance of Krivonishenko's employment at Mayak would become relevant later, when investigators noticed that some of the clothing recovered from the expedition members showed elevated readings of radioactive contamination. Whether this contamination was related to his work or to something else entirely is one of the threads in the case that has never been fully untangled. Nikolai Vladimirovich Thibaut Brignoles, Nicholas, or Kolya, was 23, a graduate of the Ural Polytechnic Institute's construction faculty who was working as an engineer at the time of the expedition. He had been on numerous previous expeditions and was considered one of the group's most experienced members. He is also one of the victims whose injuries would prove most difficult to explain. When his body was eventually recovered, the pathologist noted significant skull fracturing that was consistent with a severe traumatic impact, the kind of injury that is produced not by a fall onto snow but by a forceful blow or by being caught in something with enormous compressive force. Alexander Sergeyevich Zolotaryov, Sasha, was the oldest member of the group by a considerable margin. He was 37 years old, a veteran of the Second World War who had fought on the Eastern Front and survived experiences that most of his young companions could not have imagined. He was a hiking instructor by profession, working at a resort in the Kuban region of southern Russia, and he had joined the Dyatlov expedition under circumstances that were slightly unusual. He was not a member of the Ural Polytechnic Institute's hiking club. He had attached himself to the group relatively late in the planning process, and several of the other members did not know him well. He had insisted on coming, apparently for the purpose of completing the qualifications he needed to advance to a higher grade of hiking instructor. He would prove to be one of the most enigmatic figures in the entire case, a man whose wartime service, whose employment history, and whose choice to be photographed with an unusual camera on the expedition's final day have generated more speculation than perhaps any other single detail in the Dyatlov story. The ninth member of the group was Alexander Kolevatov, 24, a student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute who had previously worked at a classified nuclear research institute in Moscow, NII-9, which was involved in isotope separation for the Soviet nuclear weapons program, before returning to study in Sverdlovsk. Like Krivonishenko and Slobodin, he carried with him a background in the Soviet nuclear complex that would later become relevant when the question of radiation on the expedition's clothing was raised. He was described by people who knew him as intelligent, reserved, and reliable, someone who thought carefully before he spoke and who was trusted by the group's leadership. These 9 people, take a moment to hold them in mind as actual human beings, young, capable, full of the specific energy of people in their early 20s who are doing exactly what they love, who have worked and trained for this, and who are setting out with the particular mixture of excitement and seriousness that a major expedition produces. They are not abstractions. They had families waiting for them. They had plans for the spring. They had jokes they told each other and preferences about food and opinions about music and specific ways of moving through snow that their friends would recognize at a distance. And on the night of February the 1st, 1959, something ended all of that, something that 65 years later has still not been definitively explained. The expedition had been planned since the autumn of 1958, and the goal was to complete a ski trek of Category 3 difficulty, the highest category in the Soviet sports classification system, through the northern Ural Mountains, covering approximately 300 kilometers over roughly 3 weeks, and summiting 2 peaks, Ototen and Oika-Chakur. A Category 3 trek in winter conditions in the northern Urals was a serious undertaking, the kind of thing that required genuine skill and experience to complete safely, and the group assembled for it reflected this. Every member had prior experience on expeditions of Category 2 or higher difficulty, and several had been on Category 3 routes before. The group left Sverdlovsk by train on January 23, 1959. The train journey took them north and west to Ivdel, a small city that served as the administrative and logistical gateway to the northern Ural region, a city built largely by Gulag labor and still surrounded in 1959 by the infrastructure of the camp system, though the great wave of camp closures that followed Stalin's death in 1953 had reduced the system's scale considerably. From Ivdel they took a truck north to a small settlement called Vizhai, which was the last point of regular habitation on their route. Beyond Vizhai, the land belonged to the Mansi people and to the winter itself. The journey from Sverdlovsk to the mountains was its own small adventure, and the group's photographs and diary entries from these first days capture a mood of high spirits and genuine camaraderie. There are photographs of the group on the train, grinning at the camera over their shared provisions. There are photographs at Vizhai where they stayed the night and were joined briefly by a 10th member, Yuri Yudin, a student from the institute who had originally planned to complete the entire expedition, but who, the day after leaving Vizhai, was forced to turn back because of pain in his legs, diagnosed as sciatica. Yudin would spend the rest of his life carrying the knowledge that he was the only person who had been with the group and survived, not because he had done anything to survive, but simply because his body had given out early enough to save him. He lived until 2013, and he spent decades trying to understand what had happened to his friends. The group set out from Vizhai on January 28th, heading north into the forest that fringed the lower slopes of the Urals. Their route took them through taiga, the dense subarctic forest of birch and fir and pine that covers the lower elevations, and then gradually upward through the tree line and onto the open, wind-scoured upper slopes of the ridge. The weather in the first days was cold but manageable, temperatures around -15 to -20 degrees Celsius, with wind that was significant but not exceptional for the region and season. The group was making reasonable progress, camping each night in the forest where the trees provided some shelter and where building a fire was possible. Their diaries from these days are a mixture of the practical and the personal. Notes on distances covered, observations about the terrain and weather, small jokes and observations about each other and about the expedition's progress. Zina's diary in particular has a quality of engaged attention that makes it feel vivid. She notes the cold, the beauty of the landscape, the satisfaction of a hard day's skiing, the warmth of the fire at night. There is no sense, reading these entries, of a group that is frightened or in danger. There is the normal mixture of tiredness and satisfaction and companionship that a demanding expedition produces in people who are doing what they chose to do. On January 31st, the group reached the edge of the highland and the point where the forest thinned and gave way to the open upper slopes, where the wind was stronger and the cold more penetrating. They cached some of their supplies here, in a storage cache they called a labaz, a platform of sticks in the trees, high enough to keep the food away from animals, to which they planned to return on the outward journey. This was standard practice on long expeditions. Leave supplies for the return trip at a known point, carry only what you need for the forward push. The labaz cache would eventually become one of the key reference points for the rescue searchers, confirming that the group had passed this way and reached this point before the disaster. February the 1st, 1959, the group rose, broke camp, and set out across the upper slope in conditions that were, by the standards of the northern Urals in winter, not unusual: cold with wind, visibility reduced by blowing snow. They were aiming to cross the pass between Kholat-Syakhl and the next ridge to the north and then descend into the valley of the Lozva River on the other side, where they planned to camp for the night in a more sheltered position before their attempt on Otorten. But the wind and the deteriorating visibility were slowing them down, and by mid-afternoon it was clear that they were not going to reach the valley before dark. The decision was made, apparently by Dyatlov, though the precise dynamics of the decision are not recorded, to stop and make camp on the slope itself, in an exposed position without the shelter of trees, rather than turn back to the forest they had left that morning. This decision has been analyzed intensely by everyone who has subsequently studied the case, because camping on an open slope in those conditions was clearly less safe and less comfortable than retreating to the forest. The most common explanation offered is that Dyatlov did not want to lose the altitude they had gained. Descending back to the tree line and then reascending it the next morning would have cost them time and energy they could not afford if they were to stay on schedule. This is a plausible explanation, and it is the kind of calculation that experienced expeditioners make all the time. What it does not explain is why the group, having made this decision, then proceeded to pitch their tent in a position that subsequent investigators would identify as potentially vulnerable to snow loading from above, on the slope rather than below the ridge crest. But the decision was made, the tent was pitched, and the group settled in for the night. The tent was a large, expedition-grade canvas shelter of the type standard in Soviet mountaineering in this period. Not a lightweight backpacking tent, but a substantial structure designed to house a group in conditions of severe cold, with a low profile that reduced wind resistance. It was pitched with its long axis running across the slope, anchored by ski poles and skis buried in the snow, and inside it the group arranged themselves in their sleeping bags across the width of the tent. There would have been a small stove for heat, supplies organized against the walls, the group's equipment carefully sorted and accessible. Setting up this tent in the wind and cold of a Ural February evening was serious work, the kind of work that the group performed with the automatic efficiency of people who had done it many times before. By the time they were settled inside with the tent secured and the day's work done, the temperature outside was somewhere between -25 and -30 degrees Celsius, and the wind was making the canvas walls flex and shudder with the deep, rhythmic pulse of a strong mountain wind. Inside the tent, the group ate and rested and made the small preparations for sleep that are the daily routine of an expedition, checking and organizing equipment, making brief notes in diaries, probably exchanging the kind of low-key conversation that people have at the end of a hard day when the body is tired, and the warmth of a shared space is the main pleasure available. Igor Dyatlov wrote a brief, cheerful note in what would be his last diary entry, or possibly it was the group's collective expedition log, noting their position and their plans for the following day. The mood, from everything the record suggests, was ordinary, tired but satisfied, looking forward to the next day, resting within the normal routines of a group that had been living this way for several days and had settled into the rhythms of expedition life. And then something happened. We do not know what. Nobody who was inside that tent survived to tell us, and the physical evidence left behind, evidence that would be found 26 days later on February 26th, when a rescue party finally reached the campsite, suggests something that experienced mountaineers and investigators have been arguing about ever since. What the rescue party found was this. The tent was still standing, more or less in the position where it had been pitched, but its outer surface showed cuts in the canvas, cuts made from the inside with a knife, deliberately creating an opening through which a person could exit the tent. The entrance flap of the tent was still closed and secured from the inside. Someone or several people had chosen to exit through a hole cut in the wall rather than use the door. Inside the tent, the investigators found the group's belongings in a state that was not chaotic, but was also not the neat organization of a group that had left in an orderly way. Sleeping bags were present, unrolled, as if people had been inside them. The small stove was there. Food was there, including the makings of a meal that appeared to have been begun but not finished. Shoes and boots were there. This is one of the most discussed facts of the case, and one of the most difficult to explain rationally. The group had left without their footwear. Not without all their footwear. Some of the victims were later found wearing a single shoe or socks or the felt inner boots from their outer ski boots, but without the full complement of proper winter footwear that every member of the group would have. Known, absolutely and without question, was essential for survival in those temperatures. You do not walk out of your tent in -30 degrees without your boots, unless something has made staying inside the tent seem even less survivable than going without them. The footprints leaving the tent were examined by the investigators and found to be distinctive. There were 8 or 9 sets of tracks, all heading in the same general direction, northeast, down the slope and away from the tent toward the tree line in the valley below. The tracks were not the frantic, irregular prints of people running in panic. They were relatively evenly spaced, suggesting a group that was walking, moving together, in a direction and at a pace that was purposeful rather than random. After about 500 meters, the tracks became obscured by wind-blown snow and could no longer be followed with certainty, but their direction pointed toward the tree line, and it was toward the tree line that the investigators directed their search. The first 2 bodies were found at the edge of the tree line, near a large cedar tree, roughly 1,500 meters from the tent. They were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, and they were found in a state that immediately signaled something deeply wrong. Both were wearing significantly less clothing than they should have been. Krivonishenko was in his underwear and socks, Doroshenko in similar condition, and both showed signs of having been exposed to extreme cold for some time before death. The cedar tree above them had branches broken at a height of up to 5 meters, suggesting that one or both of them had climbed the tree, presumably to gain a vantage point, to see something, or to look back toward the tent. There was evidence of a small fire having been made near the base of the cedar, though the fire had been small and had not burned long enough to provide the sustained heat that would have been needed for survival. This fire is one of the small but important details of the case that gets less attention than it deserves. Making a fire in those conditions, gathering wood in the dark, in deep snow without proper gloves, in temperatures that would begin causing frostbite to bare hands within minutes, was an act that required both determination and some level of functional capability. These were not people who had collapsed immediately. They had reached the tree line, gathered wood, attempted to make fire, and survived for some period of time after leaving the tent. The fact that the fire was small and that it failed to save them tells us something about the conditions they were working in and the state they were in when they arrived at the tree, but it also tells us that whatever had driven them from the tent had not immediately incapacitated them. 3 more bodies were found on the slope between the cedar tree and the tent in positions that suggested they had been trying to return to the tent after the fire at the cedar failed to save them. Igor Dyatlov was found roughly 300 meters upslope from the cedar tree, lying on his back in the snow, his face turned toward the tent, one arm slightly raised as if bracing against a fall. He was wearing a shirt, trousers, and one felt boot liner. Not enough, nowhere near enough, for the conditions. Zina Kolmogorova was found approximately 500 meters from the tent, similarly positioned on the slope, similarly inadequately clothed. Rustem Slobodin was found between them, somewhat closer to the tent than Zina, and his autopsy would reveal that hairline skull fracture, a crack in the temporal bone that the pathologist described as unlikely to have caused immediate loss of consciousness, but that would have produced intense pain and potentially contributed to disorientation. These 3, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, had apparently tried to make it back to the tent after the fire at the cedar proved insufficient. The positions of their bodies, strung out along the slope in the direction of the tent, suggest a final effort that failed perhaps 100 or 200 meters short of its goal. Whether they knew the others were still at the cedar tree, whether they had a plan beyond reaching the tent, whether they communicated with each other in those final minutes, none of this can be determined. What the positions of the bodies tell us is the bare physical fact. They were trying to go back, and the cold took them before they got there. The 4 remaining members of the group, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibaut Brignoles, and Kolevatov, were not found until May 4, 1959, more than 2 months after the tent was discovered. They were located in a ravine approximately 70 meters from the cedar tree, under approximately 4 meters of snow, buried by the winter's accumulation to a depth that made their earlier discovery impossible without the specific kind of probing search that the searchers had not thought to conduct in that area during the February and March operations. When they were finally found, they were found together in a configuration suggesting that they had survived longer than the others. They were better dressed than the victims found on the slope, wearing clothing that appeared to have been taken from the bodies of Doroshenko and Krivonishenko at the cedar tree, suggesting a practical decision made after the other 2 were dead. But it was the injuries on these 4 that transformed the Dyatlov case from a tragic but potentially explicable mountain accident into something genuinely inexplicable. Thibaut Brignol had massive skull fracturing, a fracture described by the pathologist as so severe it was inconsistent with a fall onto soft snow, requiring instead either a forceful blow or compression by something with enormous force. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had fractured ribs, multiple ribs on both sides of the body, in patterns that the pathologist compared to the injuries produced by a car accident, specifically by the chest striking a steering wheel in a high-speed collision. The force required to produce these fractures without leaving external wounds, no bruising on the skin surface, no lacerations, no marks consistent with a blow, was something the pathologist could not satisfactorily explain within the framework of normal mountain accident causes, and Dubinina's tongue was missing. not decomposed, not taken by an animal post-mortem. Missing in a way that suggested it had been removed or lost while she was still alive, or very shortly after death. The missing tongue is perhaps the single most disturbing detail in the entire Dyatlov case, and it is worth dwelling on it precisely because it resists easy explanation. Post-mortem decomposition can cause soft tissue loss, and the four bodies had been under snow and in a stream for more than 2 months, which would have accelerated decomposition. Some investigators have argued that the tongue was lost to decomposition and scavenging, that what appeared to investigators as something sinister was simply the normal process of biological breakdown. Others have pointed out that the other soft tissues were not similarly compromised, and that the specific loss of the tongue, an organ that is well protected by the surrounding jaw, requires a more specific explanation. This is, like much of the evidence in this case, genuinely ambiguous. It can be explained innocuously, and it can be interpreted as evidence of something more disturbing, and the evidence itself does not definitively resolve the question. The Soviet investigation into the deaths was conducted by a prosecutor named Lev Ivanov, and it proceeded through the spring of 1959 with what appears, in retrospect, to have been a combination of genuine investigative effort and significant political pressure to reach a conclusion that was both definitive enough to close the case and vague enough to avoid explaining what the evidence actually showed. The investigation gathered testimony from the rescuers and searchers, conducted autopsies, examined the physical evidence from the campsite, and attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events. What it could not do was produce a satisfying explanation for the injuries, for the absence of footwear, for the cuts in the tent, for the pattern of the footprints, or for the absence of any external threat that could account for the group's behavior. The final conclusion of the investigation, that the group had been killed by an unknown compelling force, was so unsatisfying that it generated immediate skepticism, and that skepticism has only grown in the decades since. The case was officially closed in May 1959 and then classified, meaning that the case files were placed in an archive and not made available to the public. The files remained classified for decades, becoming accessible in a limited way only in the late Soviet period and more fully after the Soviet Union's collapse. The classification itself, which should probably be understood primarily as a routine Soviet bureaucratic reflex toward keeping anything potentially embarrassing out of the public record, has been interpreted by many people as evidence of a cover-up, as the authorities concealing knowledge of what actually happened. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, the classification ensured that the case would fester in the space between the known and the unknown for much longer than it might have if the files had been immediately available. The physical setting of the incident requires more attention than it has received so far, because understanding the landscape is essential to evaluating the theories about what happened. The northern Ural Mountains in this region are not dramatically high. Kholat Syakhl, the mountain on whose slope the group camped, is approximately 1,079 meters above sea level, modest by the standards of major mountain ranges. But height in the Urals is somewhat deceptive as a measure of severity because the latitude, approximately 62 degrees north, means that winter conditions in the northern Urals are extreme in ways that pure elevation does not capture. The tree line here is at a relatively low altitude, meaning that the exposed upper slopes are unprotected by vegetation for a significant portion of the total slope area, and the wind that comes across these slopes in winter is the wind of a continental interior at high latitude, cold, sustained, and carrying the particular penetrating quality of wind that has traveled a very long distance over flat terrain before reaching you. The Mansi people, who are the indigenous inhabitants of this region and who have lived here for centuries, had specific cultural attitudes toward the mountain that later investigators found significant. The name Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain, was one indicator. The Mansi had traditions that identified certain places in the landscape as having a spiritual significance that made them dangerous to visit, and the area around this particular mountain was considered by some Mansi as such a place. The investigators in 1959 interviewed Mansi community members, partly to ask whether any Mansi individuals had been on the mountain that night. An early theory posited that the Mansi might have driven the group from their campsite in a territorial dispute, and partly to understand the landscape through indigenous knowledge. The Mansi denied any involvement in the deaths, and the investigators found no evidence to the contrary. The Mansi theory was eventually set aside. The weather on the night of February 1, 1959, has been reconstructed by multiple investigators using records from weather stations in the region, and the consensus is that conditions were severe but not extraordinary for the area and time of year. Temperatures around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, wind speeds in the range of 15 to 20 meters per second, strong enough to make travel in inadequate clothing rapidly lethal, strong enough to drive the wind chill well below -40, but not exceptional in the context of winter in this region. There was no evidence of an unusual storm, no records of dramatically anomalous weather in the area on that specific night. The weather was harsh, but harsh in the way that the northern Urals are always harsh in February, and it was weather that the group, with their experience and equipment, should have been able to manage. Now let us turn to the theories, because the theories are where the Dyatlov case becomes both most interesting and most contested. Over 65 years, a remarkable range of explanations has been proposed for what happened on the slope of Dead Mountain on the night of February 1, 1959. Some of these theories are grounded in careful analysis of the available physical evidence and are endorsed by mainstream investigators and scientists. Some are speculative but intellectually serious, drawing on real phenomena that are poorly understood. And some are straightforwardly extraordinary, involving weapons testing, military secrets, entities of various kinds, and explanations that require the acceptance of things that are not established by the evidence. The interesting thing about the Dyatlov case is that the straightforwardly rational explanations have significant difficulties with the evidence, and this is why the more speculative theories have continued to find audiences. The avalanche theory is the most persistent of the rational explanations, and it received a significant boost in 2021 when a team of researchers from the Swiss Federal Institute for Snow and Avalanche Research published a study in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment arguing that a specific type of avalanche, a slab avalanche triggered by the particular geometry of the campsite and the wind loading of snow on the slope above, could explain the group's behavior, and in combination with the subsequent cold exposure, their deaths. The study used sophisticated snow modeling to show that a slab avalanche could have formed on the slope above the tent even without the grade being particularly steep, because the wind had been depositing snow specifically in the area above the tent's location, creating a loading condition that could trigger a slab release. The avalanche theory has a certain appeal because it connects the group's behavior, cutting out of the tent, moving away from it rapidly, inadequate clothing, to a rational cause. A slab of snow striking the tent in the dark would have been terrifying, would have potentially injured some members of the group immediately, and would have made remaining in the tent feel dangerous. The flight from the tent, the inadequate clothing, the movement toward the tree line, all of this makes sense if the group believed that the slope above them was actively dangerous and that their tent was in an area of continuing hazard. The injuries to the four found in the ravine, including the chest fractures and skull fracturing, could potentially be explained by the initial impact of a snow slab on people inside the tent. The problems with the avalanche theory are real and significant, and they have not been fully resolved by the 2021 study. The most persistent objection is that the rescue searchers who arrived at the campsite on February 26th found the tent still standing, not buried, not crushed, not in the condition you would expect to find a tent that had been struck by a significant avalanche. The tent was damaged, the cuts in the wall, the broken poles. but it was not destroyed or buried in the way that a slab of moving snow would typically leave a tent. Defenders of the avalanche theory argue that the specific type of slab involved would not necessarily have produced the kind of dramatic burial that the word avalanche conjures. They argue for a relatively small, contained slab that struck, damaged, and then settled rather than burying everything. Critics find this explanation insufficiently supported by the tent's actual condition. The second major objection to the avalanche theory is the footprints. If the group had been struck by an avalanche, even a relatively small one, in the middle of the night, in the dark, in severe cold, the expectation would be that at least some of them would have been injured severely enough to impair their movement, and that the footprints leaving the tent would show the irregular, disorganized pattern of a group in genuine physical distress. The tracks that the investigators described were, as noted earlier, relatively regular and organized, suggesting a group that was moving with purpose rather than staggering in injury or panic. This is not impossible to reconcile with an avalanche scenario, but it adds a complicating layer to a theory that is already carrying significant explanatory weight. The infrasound theory proposes that the group may have been affected by infrasound, sound waves at frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, in the range of approximately 18 Hz and below, generated by the wind interacting with the topography of the mountain. Infrasound in this frequency range is known to produce in some people and under some conditions a range of physiological and psychological effects, feelings of anxiety and dread, visual disturbances, a sense of presence or of being watched, and in some cases genuine panic. Researchers who have studied infrasound, including Vic Tandy, a British scientist who in the 1990s identified infrasound as the cause of what workers at a laboratory described as a haunted feeling, have documented these effects in controlled settings. The question of whether wind-generated infrasound in the specific topography of the Dyatlov Pass could have produced effects severe enough to drive 9 experienced hikers from their tent is genuinely open. The infrasound theory is attractive because it potentially explains one of the most puzzling aspects of the case: why 9 experienced, rational people would abandon a place of relative safety, the tent, for a place of much greater danger, the open slope in winter, without gathering the equipment they needed to survive. An infrasound panic could explain this because the defining characteristic of genuine infrasound-induced panic is its irrationality. It bypasses the analytical mind and produces a direct, physical response of flight. The person experiencing it does not decide to leave. They are compelled to leave by a physical sensation so overwhelming that rational calculation becomes temporarily impossible. After the stimulus ceases, after the wind shifts or the topography changes or whatever specific condition was generating, the infrasound is no longer present. The affected person returns to normal cognition but finds themselves somewhere they would not rationally have chosen to be. The difficulty with the infrasound theory is that it explains the flight from the tent better than it explains the injuries to the 4 in the ravine. Infrasound-induced panic, as currently understood, does not produce fractured ribs and shattered skulls. If the infrasound theory is correct, it can at most account for the initial evacuation of the tent and the subsequent exposure deaths. The severe blunt force injuries must then be explained by some other mechanism, and the most readily available candidate, that the 4 in the ravine fell into the ravine in the dark, is possible, but struggles to account for the specific pattern and severity of the fractures, which the pathologist compared to car accident injuries rather than fall injuries. The katabatic wind theory, sometimes proposed in conjunction with or as an alternative to the infrasound theory, suggests that the group may have been struck by a sudden katabatic wind, a dense, cold airflow that descends rapidly from higher elevations, gaining speed as it comes down the slope, and that can, in severe cases, achieve wind speeds comparable to a powerful storm with virtually no warning. Katabatic winds in the Urals are a known meteorological phenomenon, and a sufficiently strong katabatic event striking the campsite in the night could have collapsed the tent, created a situation in which the entrance was impossible to open, buried under snow or held shut by wind pressure, and forced the group to cut their way out through the side. The subsequent cold and wind, operating on a group without proper clothing, could then account for the exposure deaths. The katabatic wind theory shares the avalanche theory's difficulty with the injuries to the four in the ravine, and it also struggles to explain the relatively organized footprints leading away from the tent. A group fleeing a sudden violent wind would be expected to show more disorganized tracks than the investigators described. The theory also requires the wind to have been sufficiently powerful to make the tent entrance unusable while not simultaneously destroying the tent entirely or dispersing its contents across the slope. A specific balance of forces that is possible but not obviously consistent with the description of the campsite as the investigators found it. The military weapons testing theory has been proposed in various forms and with various levels of specificity, ranging from the relatively restrained suggestion that the group may have inadvertently wandered into a zone where military exercises or weapons tests were being conducted, to much more elaborate versions involving specific weapon systems, secret military programs, and deliberate cover-ups. The elements of the case that make military involvement seem plausible to some investigators include the radiation found on some of the clothing, the closed nature of the Soviet investigation, and subsequent classification of the files, the presence of several group members with connections to the nuclear complex, the orange spheres reported in the sky over the region by witnesses in February 1959, and the injuries to the four in the ravine, which some investigators have argued are consistent with the effects of a pressure wave from an explosion rather than blunt force impact. The radiation on the clothing is a fact of the case that deserves careful treatment because it has been discussed both responsibly and irresponsibly in the extensive literature on the case. What the investigators found was that several items of clothing, specifically some items belonging to Krivonishenko and Dubinina, showed elevated beta radiation readings when tested with a Geiger counter. The levels were described as above normal, but not at levels that would be immediately dangerous to health. The most obvious explanation, given that Krivonishenko worked at the Mayak nuclear facility, is that the contamination was work-related, that he had brought trace contamination home on his clothing from his workplace, as workers at early nuclear facilities sometimes did, before the development of rigorous decontamination procedures. This explanation is entirely plausible and does not require any extraordinary activity to be occurring on the mountain that night. However, the military activity in the region in this period is not entirely a matter of speculation. The Ural region in 1959 was one of the most militarily active zones in the Soviet Union. The nuclear facilities at Chelyabinsk 40 and Sverdlovsk 44, where some of the group's members worked, were at the heart of the Soviet nuclear weapons program, and the airspace over the northern Urals was used for various kinds of military aviation and testing. The orange spheres reported in the sky over the region in February 1959 were not reported only by the Dyatlov rescue searchers. Similar objects were reported by witnesses in other parts of the Urals during this period, and some researchers have connected them to tests of the R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile, which was undergoing flight testing at this time and whose re-entry vehicles burning through the atmosphere could potentially have appeared as luminous objects moving across the night sky. The question of whether military activity of any kind directly caused the deaths of the Dyatlov group, as opposed to providing a background context of technological activity in the region, is one that the available evidence does not resolve. No specific military test or exercise has been identified that would have been occurring in the immediate vicinity of Kholat Syakhl on the night of February 1st, 1959. The orange spheres, whatever they were observed at distances and altitudes that make them unlikely candidates for a direct cause of physical injury to people on the ground. The radiation on the clothing, as noted, has a more mundane explanation readily available. The classification of the case files is consistent with Soviet bureaucratic reflexes about any investigation that touched on the activities of closed cities and nuclear workers, whether or not there was anything specific to conceal. There is another theory, one that has received less attention than the military and avalanche explanations, but that has a specific physical basis that makes it worth discussing in detail. This is the hypothesis that what drove the group from their tent was not a physical force acting from outside the tent, but a psychological force acting from within it. Specifically, the possibility that carbon monoxide poisoning from the tent's small stove created a situation in which the group's judgment was severely impaired before they acted. Carbon monoxide poisoning at sublethal levels produces a specific cluster of symptoms that includes intense headache, nausea, confusion, and a paradoxical feeling of heat, the sensation of being too warm, even in cold conditions, which could explain why some members of the group shed clothing that they needed to stay alive. It also produces the kind of confused, impaired cognition that might lead people to make the decision to exit the tent through the wall rather than the door, and to move away from the tent without gathering the equipment they needed. The carbon monoxide theory has genuine explanatory power for some elements of the case, but it requires the stove to have been running at the time the group left the tent, and the investigators found the stove in the tent but did not record whether it was in a state consistent with recent operation. The theory also does not explain the injuries to the four in the ravine and its struggles with the relatively organized footprints. A group severely affected by carbon monoxide poisoning would be expected to show more disorganization in their movement than the footprints suggest. Let us step back from the specific theories for a moment and think about the structure of the problem, because the Dyatlov case is unusual not just for the mystery it presents, but for the specific character of that mystery. Most unsolved cases are unsolved because there is insufficient evidence. The evidence has been destroyed or was never collected, and the gap between what we know and what we need to know is simply too large to bridge. The Dyatlov case is different. There is substantial evidence: the tent, the footprints, the bodies, the autopsies, the diaries, the photographs, the testimony of the rescuers. The problem is not that there is too little evidence, but that the evidence is internally contradictory, that no single explanation accounts for all of it simultaneously, and that every theory that explains one aspect of the case creates difficulties for another. The footprints say the group left calmly. The missing boots say they left in extreme urgency or confusion. The organized retreat toward the cedar tree says they had a plan. The absence of proper clothing says the plan was formed without the time or capacity for rational preparation. The injuries to the four in the ravine say something with enormous force acted on their bodies. The absence of external wounds says that force did not come from outside. The fact that the four survived longest and were better dressed says they made rational decisions at some point, taking clothing from the dead, sheltering together in the ravine. The fact that all four still died says their decisions were not enough. Every time you pull on one thread, another one tightens. The photographs from the expedition's final days have been analyzed exhaustively, and a few details have attracted particular attention. One set of photographs, apparently taken by Zolotaryov's camera, shows the group in camp in conditions of poor visibility. The images are dark and slightly blurred, consistent with being taken at dusk or in difficult light conditions. Some researchers have argued that these photographs were taken on the final evening, in the hours before whatever happened, and that they show the group in a specific location that helps confirm the sequence of events. Others have argued that the camera evidence is less clear than this analysis suggests, and that the photographs cannot be definitively dated to the final evening. Zolotaryov himself, the older, wartime veteran who had joined the group late, has attracted a particular kind of sustained attention from researchers, partly because of the circumstances of his joining the expedition, and partly because of what was found on his body. He was found with two cameras, one of which was the one that had taken the final photographs. He was also found with a significant quantity of cash, more cash than would be normal for a hiking trip, and with what some researchers have described as an unusual assortment of personal items. The suggestion that Zolotaryov was, in addition to being a hiking instructor, something else, an informer for the KGB, or an agent of some kind assigned to observe the group, has been raised repeatedly in the case literature, though no direct evidence of any such role has ever been produced from the archives, which have been at least partially accessible since the Soviet Union's collapse. The 2019 investigation reopened by the Russian authorities produced a conclusion, an official conclusion, from the Russian Prosecutor General's office that the group died as a result of an avalanche, and that the investigation had been closed in 1959 on the basis of insufficient evidence rather than any cover-up of facts. The 2019 report was received with widespread skepticism by researchers and by the families of the victims, not because an avalanche is an impossible explanation, but because the specific form of the avalanche theory adopted by the 2019 investigation did not adequately address the physical evidence, in particular the injuries to the four in the ravine, the condition of the tent as found, and the pattern of the footprints. The Russian authorities' determination to close the case through an official finding of natural causes was seen by many as a continuation of the same impulse that had driven the original 1959 classification, the desire for closure, for an official verdict, rather than a full reckoning with the evidence's genuine ambiguities. The families of the 9, the parents and siblings and friends who spent years without answers, who were told officially that their loved ones had died of natural causes without being told what natural causes, experienced the case's unresolved nature in a particular way that is worth acknowledging. For the first decades after the deaths, the case was officially closed and the files inaccessible, which meant that the families had no way to ask questions or receive answers, even if they wanted to. The social and political climate of the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 1970s was not one in which the families of people who had died in unclear circumstances near a closed city were encouraged to investigate. Some of the families accepted the official explanation, not from conviction but from the pragmatic recognition that challenging it was futile. Others spent years in private uncertainty, comparing notes with each other, preserving whatever records they could, waiting for the moment when the files might become accessible. Yuri Yudin, the 10th member of the group who had turned back because of his bad leg, lived for 54 years with the knowledge of his survival and the weight of his friends' deaths. He participated in multiple investigations over the decades, provided testimony and context, and returned to the pass in 1990 when the case files were first partially opened. He was reportedly certain that what had happened to his friends was not a natural accident, though he could not say what it was. He died in 2013 at the age of 75, without an answer. The pass itself, the Dyatlov Pass, as it has been known since 1959, renamed in honor of the group's leader, is today a place of pilgrimage for hikers and researchers who make the journey to the northern Urals to stand on the slope where the tent was pitched and look at the landscape that the 9 saw in their last hours. The terrain is open, austere, beautiful in the way of landscapes that do not moderate themselves for human comfort. A wide, gradual slope of tundra vegetation and snow, the ridgeline above it clean against the sky, the tree line of the valley below a visible boundary between the sheltered world and the exposed one. People who make this journey report that the scale of the landscape, the distances, the cold, the wind, the absence of shelter, helps them understand something about the case that no document quite conveys. What it means to be out here at night in February without proper clothing. The distance from the tent to the cedar tree, roughly 1,500 meters across an open, snow-covered slope in the dark, in a wind that was strong enough to have been contributing to the group's decision to camp rather than continue, is a distance that you can read on a map without fully registering what it means in physical terms. It means approximately 20 to 30 minutes of difficult walking through knee-deep snow, in inadequate clothing, in temperatures that would have been causing frostbite to exposed skin within minutes of leaving the relative shelter of the tent. The fact that the group made this crossing, that they reached the tree line and found the cedar and attempted to build a fire, tells us about the physical capability and the determination or the desperation of at least some of the members. They were not passive, they were trying to survive. The cedar tree itself, with that large old tree at the edge of the tree line with its branches broken at height, is in some ways the most haunting physical object in the case. Someone climbed that tree in the dark and the cold, breaking branches as they went, ascending to a height of 5 meters or more, presumably to gain a vantage point from which to see something, to see back toward the tent, to see whether whatever had driven them from the tent was still a threat, to see something that justified the extraordinary effort of climbing a tree in those conditions. We do not know if they saw anything. We do not know whether the climbing was Doroshenko, Krivonishenko, or both of them. We do not know whether what they saw, or failed to see, informed any subsequent decision. The tree is silent about all of this, as the mountain is silent about all of it, as the whole landscape maintains its magnificent and terrible indifference to the questions it has generated. The question of what the group saw or experienced in the minutes and hours before their deaths, the subjective experience of that night, the specific quality of whatever caused 9 experienced people to do something so fundamentally contrary to their training and their survival instincts, is the question that makes the Dyatlov case something more than a historical puzzle. It is a question about the limits of human experience, about the things that can happen to a person in an extreme environment that lie outside the categories available for explanation. The tradition of mountain literature is full of accounts of climbers and hikers who experienced phenomena in extreme conditions: visual hallucinations, auditory illusions, a sense of presence, a sudden and overwhelming certainty that something specific and action requiring was happening, that they could not later explain in terms of the physical environment. The human mind at altitude, in extreme cold, under conditions of oxygen deprivation and physical exhaustion, is capable of experiences that are entirely real to the person having them and entirely unaccountable to outside analysis. There is a concept in mountain rescue practice called paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon well documented in hypothermia cases where the affected person, as their body temperature drops to dangerous levels and their peripheral blood vessels dilate in a last attempt to preserve core temperature, experiences a sudden, intense sensation of warmth that leads them to remove their clothing. It is a deeply counterintuitive phenomenon, and it is real. People in the late stages of hypothermia sometimes undress themselves completely and are found after death with their clothing beside them, apparently removed voluntarily. The inadequate clothing of some of the Dyatlov group members has been attributed to paradoxical undressing, and this is a genuinely plausible explanation for that specific element of the case, though it works better as an explanation for the final stages of the deaths than for the initial decision to leave the tent. Similarly, the behavior of burrowing, which rescuers noticed in the case of some bodies that were found in positions suggesting they had been digging into the snow, sheltering in depressions, is also documented in hypothermia cases, a behavior called terminal burrowing, in which the dying person instinctively seeks enclosed space, a kind of regression to a protective posture. If some of the Dyatlov group members were in the late stages of hypothermia when they died, these phenomena could account for some of the more puzzling details of their final positions and conditions. What they cannot account for, i.e., what no physiological explanation of the dying process accounts for, is the cause of the process itself, the thing that initiated the chain of events by driving 9 people from their tent into the Ural night. The 60th anniversary of the incident in 2019 produced a significant surge of renewed interest and new analysis, culminating in both the Russian government's official reinvestigation and a number of independent research projects that used modern investigative techniques, including the snow modeling study from the Swiss researchers, to re-examine the physical evidence. The 60th anniversary coverage brought the case to a new global audience, many of whom encountered it for the first time through documentaries, podcast episodes, and a popular English-language book by journalist Donny Eichar, and the subsequent 5 years have seen additional analysis, additional archival research, and additional debate about the available theories. What 65 years of investigation has produced is, in some ways, a richer understanding of the case's complexity and a deeper appreciation of why it resists resolution. The researchers who have spent the most time with the evidence, who have read the original Soviet investigation files, who have visited the pass, who have interviewed the surviving witnesses before they died, who have tested the physical evidence with modern analytical methods, are generally more cautious about definitive explanations than the people who encounter the case casually. The more you know about the Dyatlov case, the less confident you tend to be about any single theory, because the more you know, the more clearly you can see the ways in which every theory struggles with some portion of the evidence. This epistemic situation, knowing enough to understand the complexity but not enough to resolve it, is uncomfortable for the human mind, which wants pattern and explanation and closure. The appeal of the Dyatlov case to popular audiences is partly the appeal of a genuinely good mystery, but it is also partly the appeal of a mystery that resists the kind of neat resolution that satisfies the pattern-seeking impulse. Every documentary about the case promises answers and delivers instead a deeper appreciation of the questions. Every new theory generates counter-arguments that the theory's proponents cannot satisfactorily address. The case has become a kind of cultural object in its own right, a shared reference point for the experience of genuine uncertainty, for the limits of what investigation and analysis can recover from the past. Let us return in the end to the 9 people because they risk being lost in the theories and the analyses and the competing explanations. They were students and young professionals in the Soviet Union in 1959, which means they were living in a world that was emerging cautiously and unevenly from the terror of the Stalin years. The Khrushchev thaw was underway, the cultural and intellectual climate was fractionally freer than it had been in the previous decade, and young people of their generation were beginning to develop a culture of outdoor activity and adventure that was partly an aesthetic preference and partly an expression of a desire for spaces where the state was not present, where you could simply be yourself in the company of people you chose. The hiking and skiing expeditions organized by the Ural Polytechnic Institute Sports Club were not just athletic activities, they were part of a social world that many participants valued as much as any formal education or professional achievement. The photographs that the group took during the expedition, many of which survive and have been published, show people who are physically tired and clearly happy, who are joking with each other and working together and living with the particular intensity that comes from sustained physical effort in a challenging environment. Zina is grinning, dark-eyed and wind-burned. Dyatlov is concentrating on something as he usually is in photographs, but there is warmth in his face. Zolotaryov, the oldest, the veteran, the one who is slightly separate from the rest by age and history, is looking at the camera with an expression that is harder to read, thoughtful perhaps, or simply the expression of a man who has already seen enough of life's capacity for disaster that a ski trek in difficult conditions does not produce the same uncomplicated pleasure it produces in his younger companions. The last photograph taken on Zolotaryov's camera, one of the final images from the expedition, shows what appears to be a group of people, their faces not clearly visible, in conditions of poor light and apparent wind. Researchers have studied this photograph for decades without reaching consensus on what it shows. Some see evidence of an external threat, a light source or a figure that should not be there. Others see simply the normal visual confusion of a poorly lit photograph taken in difficult conditions. The photograph is one of the case's most ambiguous artifacts, potentially significant, impossible to read with certainty, like so much else about the 9 people and the night that ended their lives on the slope of Dead Mountain. Before we reach the mountain's final silence, let us slow down and inhabit each member of this group more completely, because the human beings at the center of this story have sometimes been reduced to their roles in the mystery rather than understood as the full, specific people they were. Igor Dyatlov, for instance, was not only a competent expedition leader. He was a young man who had grown up in Sverdlovsk in the post-war years, who had been shaped by the particular atmosphere of a Soviet industrial city in the late Stalin period, a place of enormous technical ambition, of genuine intellectual vitality in the scientific institutes and polytechnics, but also a place of pervasive anxiety and surveillance that had defined Soviet life for 2 decades. His commitment to the outdoors, to expeditions and skiing, and the freedom of the mountains was not incidental to his character. It was one of the primary ways in which a young Soviet man of his generation could experience something genuinely his own, something not administered or overseen, something that belonged to the people doing it rather than to the institution or the state. The Ural Polytechnic Institute's hiking and skiing club, the UPI Tourist Section, as it was formerly known, was one of a number of similar organizations at Soviet universities and institutes that had grown significantly in the late 1950s as the Khrushchev thaw opened some space for activities that were not directly supervised by the party apparatus. These clubs organized expeditions, maintained equipment, trained members in mountaineering and skiing skills, and provided a social world centered on shared physical experience rather than ideology. The culture of these clubs was earnest, technically focused, and genuinely communal in the sense that the members genuinely shared their experiences and their resources and their risk. The Dyatlov group was not simply a collection of individuals who happened to be doing the same trek. It was a community with the specific trust and interdependence that communities built around shared physical risk develop. Zina Kolmogoreva's diaries, which have been published in fragments and quoted extensively in the case literature, reveal a person of considerable interior richness alongside the physical capability and social warmth that her contemporaries describe. She was someone who paid attention to the quality of experience, who noticed the specific beauty of a particular moment in a particular landscape and found words for it, who was alert to the texture of the group's emotional life and recorded it with a specificity that goes beyond mere note-taking into something approaching genuine literary observation. Her final diary entries, read with the knowledge of what followed, have a quality that is almost unbearable. The writer has no idea. She is noting the wind picking up and thinking about tomorrow's route, and the specific tiredness of her legs and the warmth of the tea, and the gap between her certainty that tomorrow would come and the fact that it did not is as complete as any gap the historical record contains. Semyon Zolotaryov, the war veteran, the oldest, the outsider, is the figure in the group who most rewards sustained attention. He was born in 1921 in a Cossack village in the Kuban region, grew up in a rural community that was devastated by the collectivization campaigns of the early 1930s and was drafted into the Red Army at the beginning of the German invasion in 1941. He fought on the Eastern Front for 4 years, survived some of the most intense combat in the history of modern warfare, and emerged in 1945 as one of the millions of Soviet veterans who had experienced things that their society was not fully equipped to absorb. He worked in various capacities after the war: physical education instructor, hiking guide, resort worker, before ending up as a hiking instructor at a resort in the Kuban, which was where he was working when he attached himself to the Dyatlov expedition. What drew him to this particular group at this particular time, in the Ural Mountains rather than the Caucasus where he was based, has never been fully explained. The official explanation that he needed to complete a Category 3 expedition for his professional qualifications is plausible, but the specific choice of this group, this route, this timing, has a slightly calculated quality that some researchers have found suspicious. Several researchers have noted that Zolotaryov was photographed on the expedition more than most other members, and that the photographs he took on the final day, the ones found on his camera, represent an unusual level of photographic activity for a person whose main purpose was hiking qualification. Whether this reflects simple personal interest in photography, a specific professional purpose, or something more opaque, the evidence does not resolve. The wartime experience that Zolotaryov carried was real and formative in ways that would not have been visible from the outside. The Eastern Front in 1941-1945 was a theatre of violence of a scale and intensity that is difficult to fully comprehend, and the men who survived it were changed by it in ways that persisted for the rest of their lives. Zolotaryov had survived things that many of his comrades had not, and this survival, combined with 20 years of life since the war, would have given him a specific relationship to danger and to mortality that was different from the relationship of his younger companions. He knew, in a way that 23-year-olds cannot quite know, that things end, that the specific quality of a moment in the sun on a cold slope with people you like is finite, that the body can be broken, that the world contains more capacity for destruction than the young generally believe. Whether this knowledge helped him or hindered him in the final hours of February 1st is something we cannot know. The terrain of the northern Urals that the group was crossing has its own history and its own character that bear on the case. The Mansi, the indigenous people who have lived in this region for centuries, had a complex relationship with the mountains that the Soviet states' mapping and administrative categories did not fully capture. The Mansi divided their landscape into zones of different spiritual character, places that were safe for human activity, places that required specific ritual protocols before entry, and places that were simply closed, where human presence was not appropriate, and where harm to those who ignored this prohibition was understood as a natural consequence rather than a supernatural punishment. The area around Kolatsiakhul was, in Mansi understanding, one of the problematic areas, not necessarily the most forbidden, but sufficiently marked by spiritual significance that a Mansi person would not choose to camp there and would not be surprised to hear that people who did camp there had come to grief. This does not mean, to be clear, that the Dyatlov group were killed by a supernatural force, or that the Mansi understanding of the landscape is a literal description of a physical mechanism. What it does mean is that the Mansi had accumulated through generations of living in this landscape an empirical knowledge of its character that was encoded in spiritual language, the way that many indigenous cultures encode environmental knowledge in narrative and spiritual frameworks that serve as practical guides even when their cosmological premises are not accepted. The Mansi knew that this area of the mountains was inhospitable, that people who camped in certain places tended to come to harm, that the wind and the snow behaved in particular ways in this specific topography. Their cultural response to this knowledge was to frame it in spiritual terms. The physical mechanism underlying the knowledge was real regardless of the framework. The specific topography of the slope where the group camped has been surveyed and analyzed in considerable detail by researchers with various theoretical purposes, and a number of features of the terrain have been identified as potentially significant. The slope has a gentle gradient, approximately 15 to 20 degrees, that is within the range where slab avalanche formation is possible, but not in the steep range where avalanches are most common. Above the campsite, the slope rises toward the ridge in a configuration that would allow wind to deposit snow in the area above the tent, creating precisely the kind of overloaded condition that the Swiss researchers identified as the potential trigger for the slab avalanche they proposed. The ravine where the four bodies were eventually found is a natural drainage feature that runs roughly perpendicular to the slope's direction, creating a depression that would act as a trap for cold air pooling and as a location where deep snow would naturally accumulate, which is consistent with the 4 meters of snow under which the bodies were buried. The cedar tree that stands at the tree line, or stood there in 1959, since it is not known whether the specific tree survives, was large enough and old enough that it would have been visible from a significant distance on the slope above, even at night with limited visibility, because it was larger than the surrounding trees and its location at the forest's edge made it a natural landmark. A group moving down the slope in the dark, trying to reach the tree line, would have used the most prominent tree at the forest's edge as a navigation target, which explains why they converged on that specific location rather than entering the forest at a different point. The broken branches at height are consistent with someone attempting to use the tree as an elevated observation point, the kind of desperate improvisation that makes complete sense if you are trying to see back up the slope toward your tent in poor visibility, and the only way to get higher is to climb. The fire that was built at the base of the cedar was small, the evidence suggests, and short-lived. Making fire in those conditions, gathering wood from the surrounding forest in deep snow with inadequate hand protection in strong wind, would have been extremely difficult and would have consumed energy that the group members had in diminishing supply. The fact that a fire was made at all speaks to determination and to some remaining physical capability. The fact that it was not maintained or enlarged enough to provide serious warmth speaks to the deteriorating condition of the people making it. A fire adequate to keep 9 people warm through a Ural February night would have required sustained effort by multiple capable people working over an extended period. What was apparently built was the kind of fire you build when you are already losing the fight against cold, just enough to give brief warmth, not enough to change the outcome. Let us consider what the 2 men who died at the cedar tree, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, might have been experiencing in the time between leaving the tent and their deaths. They were in the late stages of hypothermia, which produces a progression of symptoms that is well documented in the medical literature. In the early stages, the body responds to cold with shivering and increased metabolic activity, trying to generate heat through muscular contraction. As the core temperature drops, the shivering becomes uncontrolled and then eventually stops. The muscles can no longer maintain the intensity of contraction required. Cognitive function begins to deteriorate. The person becomes confused, has difficulty making decisions, loses fine motor control. The characteristic blue coloring of the skin appears as circulation to the extremities is cut off to preserve core temperature. Paradoxical undressing may occur, as previously described, if the core temperature drops far enough to produce the vasodilation that creates the sensation of warmth. In their final minutes, if the hypothermia literature applies, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko would have been in a state of profound physical and cognitive impairment, unable to make complex decisions, unable to perform coordinated actions, experiencing the characteristic unreality of severe cold exposure, where the urgency of the situation is present as a kind of background awareness, but the capacity to act on it is gone. The fire they had built would have been failing, its warmth insufficient against the wind and the cold, and the warmth of the fire might itself have been part of the paradoxical comfort of the dying, just enough heat to ease the final stage of a process that was already irreversible. The 3 who attempted to return to the tent, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin, made a decision that, in the circumstances, was both rational and futile. The tent was upslope 1/500 meters away, with whatever had driven them from it still potentially present or still present in their minds as a danger. But the tent also represented survival equipment, boots, sleeping bags, warm clothing, the stove, and people who are in the early stages of cold-related cognitive impairment tend to focus on concrete, familiar solutions to problems. The tent was the solution they knew, the place where the things needed to survive were located, and the attempt to return to it was the attempt of people whose training was still overriding their deteriorating cognitive function, pointing them toward the correct action, even as their ability to complete it was being eroded by the cold. Slobodin's skull fracture, the hairline crack in the temporal bone, raises questions that no theory has satisfactorily answered. A hairline fracture of this type requires a specific kind of impact, not a glancing blow, not a compression by soft material, but a focused impact against a hard surface or by a hard object. The pathologist in 1959 concluded that the fracture was unlikely to have caused immediate loss of consciousness or death by itself, and recorded the cause of death as hypothermia, which is consistent with the physical evidence of his position and condition. But how did a person receive a hairline skull fracture in a setting where the most likely hard surfaces, the frozen ground, rocks beneath the snow, would typically produce either more severe injury on direct impact or no injury at all on impact through the cushioning of deep snow? Was the fracture received in or near the tent during whatever initial event drove the group outside? Was it received on the slope from a fall? Was it received at the cedar tree in some kind of altercation or accident? The fracture is a data point that the available theories absorb with varying degrees of discomfort, but that none explain with full satisfaction. The four in the ravine, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibault-Brignol, and Kolevatov, present the case's most extreme interpretive challenges. They survived longer than their companions, which implies they made better decisions in the immediate aftermath of leaving the tent. They stayed together, they took clothing from the dead, they found a sheltered location. These are all rational survival strategies, the kind of thing that trained expeditioners know to do. The fact that they did these things, and that even in whatever extreme circumstances had driven them from the tent and killed 2 of their number at the cedar tree, they retained enough cognitive capacity and enough training to implement survival strategies, tells us something about their condition and their capability in those hours. And yet they died, despite the better clothing, despite the shelter of the ravine, despite staying together. They died. The injuries that made their deaths so disturbing to the investigators were not the cause of their deaths by cold, which would have happened regardless, but the cause of additional suffering whose source remains unaccounted for. The chest fractures on Dubinina and Zolotaryov, multiple ribs broken bilaterally in patterns the pathologist compared to car accident injuries, required a force that compact snow and a fall into a ravine would not typically generate. The skull fracturing of Thibault-Brignol was severe enough that the pathologist could not account for it by any mechanism consistent with a fall onto snow. Dubinina's missing tongue, whatever its ultimate explanation, is a detail that the physical evidence preserves without the context that would make it comprehensible. One hypothesis for the chest fractures that has received some serious consideration is that they were produced by a technique known in wilderness first aid contexts, chest compressions, performed in an attempt to revive a person who has apparently died of cold. In the early stages of hypothermia-induced cardiac arrest, the heart can sometimes be restarted by vigorous chest compression, and the group members would have known this. If Dubinina or Zolotaryov appeared to die and was subjected to aggressive resuscitation attempts by other group members, the resulting rib fractures would be consistent with the pattern described. This hypothesis has the advantage of explaining the injuries without requiring any external force, and it is consistent with a group of people who were trained in first aid and who were trying to save each other. It has the disadvantage of requiring the compression to have been extremely vigorous, more vigorous than standard first aid protocols, though hypothermic bodies are less flexible and more resistant to compression, and it does not account for the skull fracturing of Thibaut Brignol. The question of what happened in the ravine, whether the four died in sequence or approximately simultaneously, whether there was any communication with the group members on the slope above, whether the shelter of the ravine made any meaningful difference to how long they survived, is one that the physical evidence cannot answer. Bodies buried under 4 meters of snow for 3 months do not preserve the sequence of events the way a crime scene preserved within hours might. What the investigators found in May was a snapshot of the final state, not a record of the process by which that state was reached. The specific timing of each death, the final conscious experiences of each person, the last thoughts and sensations of 4 people dying together in a snow-filled ravine in the northern Urals, all of this is gone, absorbed into the mountain's silence as completely as the snow that buried them. The Soviet investigation's classification of the case, placing it in a restricted archive where it remained inaccessible until the late 1980s, has shaped the case's subsequent history in ways that extended beyond simple information suppression. Classification created the conditions for rumor and speculation to develop in the absence of facts, allowing theories of extraordinary causes to fill the space left by the withheld evidence. When the files became partially accessible, the researchers who read them found not the evidence of a cover-up of specific extraordinary events, not the smoking gun that would explain the military involvement or the secret weapons test, but rather the evidence of an investigation that had been conducted with some competence but had been closed before it reached satisfying conclusions under political pressure that prevented the kind of sustained, open investigation that the evidence warranted. The classification had created the expectation of extraordinary secrets. What it had actually been protecting was the ordinary institutional embarrassment of a bureaucracy that did not know what had happened and did not want to say so publicly. This is, in its way, a profound and human outcome. The mystery deepened not by suppression of the truth, but by suppression of the uncertainty. If the Soviet government had said in 1959, 9 people died in unclear circumstances that we cannot fully explain, and we are closing the investigation without a definitive conclusion, the subsequent history of the case would have been very different. The uncertainty would have been acknowledged. The families might have been able to make a different kind of peace with what had happened, and the theories that have proliferated in the space created by classification would have had less room to develop. Instead, the decision to classify, motivated by the reflexes of a system that was constitutionally incapable of admitting uncertainty to the public, ensured that the uncertainty would survive and grow, that each generation of researchers would approach the case carrying both the hope of a final answer and the suspicion that the answer was being hidden from them. The case has a particular resonance for the generation of Russians who grew up in the late Soviet period, the generation that came of age in the 1970s and 1980s, when the Soviet system's failures were visible but not yet discussable, when the gap between official accounts and lived experience was a daily feature of life. For this generation, the Dyatlov case was a paradigm case of that gap. 9 people dead in unexplained circumstances, an official verdict that explained nothing, files closed and inaccessible, a society that was expected to accept the official account without question. The case resonated with an entire generation's experience of living in a system that managed truth administratively, and this resonance has given it a cultural weight in Russia that goes beyond the intrinsic mystery of the events themselves. The 65th anniversary of the incident in 2024, the year we are now in, has passed without resolution. The 9 are still dead. The mountain still holds whatever secret it holds. The theories continue to accumulate and to contest each other, and the evidence continues to resist the explanations offered for it. New researchers bring new methods and new perspectives, and some of what they find is genuinely illuminating. The Swiss snow modeling, the archival work on Soviet military testing in the region, the forensic analysis of the photographs. But none of it has produced the single, definitive, evidence-consistent explanation that would close the case in the same way that a successfully solved investigation closes a case. What the continued existence of the mystery does, 65 years on, is create a kind of ongoing relationship between the present and that specific night in February 1959. The 9 people on the slope of Dead Mountain are not simply historical figures, not simply data points in a case file. They continue to exist in a strange way as long as the question of what happened to them remains open. Every researcher who reads Zena's diary, every hiker who stands on the slope and looks at the terrain, every person who stays up late following the threads of the case on a Russian-language forum at 2 in the morning is in some way keeping the 9 present, insisting that their deaths have not been fully accounted for, that the story is not over, that someone is still paying attention. The Northern Urals in February are, by all accounts of those who have made the journey, exactly as demanding and exactly as beautiful as the evidence of the case suggests. The landscape has a clarity that comes from the absence of human modification. No roads, no buildings, no infrastructure, just the long slope of the ridge and the tree line below it and the sky above, with the specific quality of winter sky at high latitude that is different from the sky anywhere further south, lower, heavier, and on clear days a blue that has a quality of transparency, as if the sky were thinner here and the dark behind it closer. The wind is continuous, the cold is thorough, and the mountain, as it has always been, is indifferent to the questions asked of it. Let us spend time with one more theory, one that has received relatively little attention in the English language literature, but that has been discussed seriously in the Russian research community. The hypothesis that what happened to the Dyatlov group was caused not by a natural phenomenon or a military accident, but by a psychological crisis amplified by the specific conditions of the night. This hypothesis does not require exotic causes or state secrets. It requires only a recognition of how extreme cold, darkness, sleep deprivation, and physical exhaustion interact with the human nervous system to produce states of consciousness and behavior that are genuinely difficult to predict or control even in experienced, well-trained people. Sleep deprivation alone, and the group had been sleeping in the interrupted, inadequate way of people on a demanding winter expedition for several days, produces measurable cognitive impairment that compounds with cold. The research on cold-induced cognitive impairment is extensive and consistent. As core temperature drops even slightly below normal, the brain's ability to perform complex reasoning, risk assessment, and decision-making degrades in ways that the affected person typically cannot perceive in themselves. You feel alert, you are not. You feel certain, you are confused. This disconnect between subjective experience and objective performance is one of the most dangerous features of cold-related cognitive impairment because it removes the internal signal that would normally prompt corrective action. A group of people in a tent at -30 degrees after several days of hard skiing and inadequate sleep in the middle of the night when the circadian rhythm is at its lowest point. This group is already operating in a cognitive environment that is compromised relative to their normal capabilities even before any specific threat or event. If something then occurred to produce fear, a sound, a sensation, a collapse of part of the tent under snow loading, even the kind of shared panic that can cascade through a small, closely bonded group in a confined space. The response of impaired cognition to that fear might well look like what the physical evidence shows: rapid, determined, partially rational action that is also fundamentally inadequate to the survival requirements of the situation. Cut out, get away, head for the trees. These are not the actions of people who have lost the ability to form plans. They are the actions of people whose plans are being formed with insufficient information and insufficient cognitive capacity in a framework of fear that overrides the careful risk assessment that their training would normally provide, the social dynamics of the group in those final hours, the way that individuals in a small, frightened group reinforce each other's fear or each other's calm, the way that the presence of an acknowledged leader shapes collective response to crisis, cannot be reconstructed from the physical evidence, but they are relevant to any attempt to understand what happened. A group of 9 people in a tent together are not 9 independent decision-makers. They are a social system, and the behavior of that system in a crisis is shaped by the dynamics of the system as much as by the objective facts of the crisis. If Igor Dyatlov, calm, competent, trusted, made the decision to exit the tent, others would have followed without necessarily independently evaluating the decision. If Zolotaryov, the war veteran, the oldest, the one with the most experience of genuine mortal danger, showed fear, the group's response to his fear would have been amplified by the authority his experience gave him. We will never know who made the first cut in the tent wall. We will never know whose voice spoke first, or whether there were voices at all, whether the decision to exit was made in speech or in action, whether it was a conscious collective decision or an individual impulse that others followed without fully processing. The cut in the tent wall is the most physical and most durable record of that moment. Someone had a knife, someone used it, someone went through the opening. Everything that led to that action, every thought and sensation and calculation that preceded the knife going into the canvas, is gone. The experience of reading about the Dyatlov case, and there are now dozens of books and hundreds of serious articles and an extensive online literature, is the experience of accumulating detail without accumulating understanding. Each new piece of information, each new analysis, each new testimony adds to the total body of knowledge about the case without resolving the fundamental question at its center. This is unusual in the literature of unsolved cases, where more information generally moves you toward understanding, even if it does not reach it. In the Dyatlov case, more information seems sometimes to move you laterally. It expands the picture, it adds texture and specificity, but it does not narrow the space of possible explanations. After 65 years, the space of possible explanations is approximately the same size as it was in 1959. We know much more about the context, the group's backgrounds, the Soviet military activity in the region, the specific physics of snow and wind on the slope. But the core uncertainty is unchanged. The case has been compared by several writers to the mystery of the Mary Celeste. The ship found abandoned in the Atlantic in 1872 with its crew gone and no explanation for their departure. The comparison is illuminating in its similarities and its differences. Both cases involve people who left a place of relative safety for a place of greater danger without the equipment needed to survive. Both cases produced physical evidence that suggests something happened suddenly and without time for proper preparation. Both cases have generated decades of competing theories without a definitive resolution, and both cases have become cultural objects, reference points for the experience of genuine mystery, for the limits of investigation, for the capacity of the world to produce events that resist explanation. The difference is that the Dyatlov case has a human specificity that the Mary Celeste lacks. We know who the 9 people were. We have their photographs, their diaries, the testimonies of their friends. We can follow them from Sverdlovsk on the train to Vizhay on the truck, to the mountains on their skis, and we can read their words from each day of the journey, and the movement from that specificity, those specific people, that specific writing, to the silence of the final night and everything that followed, is a movement that produces a particular kind of grief. These are not nameless sailors on a merchant ship. They are Zina and Igor and Lyuda and Rustam, and the 2 Yuris and Kolya and Sasha and Alexander, and their names and their faces and their words are in the record, and the mountain took all of it anyway. The ongoing nature of the case, The fact that it continues to be actively investigated and actively debated rather than being assigned to the closed archive of history's unsolved problems reflects something about the specific quality of the mystery that keeps it alive. Part of what keeps it alive is the genuine intellectual puzzle. The evidence is interesting, the theories are testable in various ways, and the case rewards the kind of careful, evidence-focused analysis that serious researchers enjoy. But part of what keeps it alive is something less intellectual and more emotional. The 9 people who died on that slope were young and capable, and they did not deserve what happened to them. And the fact that we do not know what happened to them means that their deaths have not been fully acknowledged, fully witnessed, fully absorbed into the human record. The ongoing investigation is, among other things, an ongoing act of attention, a refusal to let the question go, because letting the question go would feel like a final abandonment of the people at its center. The Soviet Union in 1959 was a country with an extraordinary capacity for creating situations in which the truth was simultaneously known and unacknowledgeable. The Gulag system, which had operated for decades on a massive scale, was something that virtually every Soviet citizen knew about and that could not be discussed openly. The nuclear accidents, Kishtim in 1957, the contamination of the Teka river system, the various incidents at closed facilities whose names could not appear in print, were known in the regions where they had occurred and unknown officially. The deaths of 9 students in the Ural Mountains in February 1959 were not in the same category as these larger secrets. They were a local tragedy, a sad event affecting a community of young people and their families, not a matter of national security, but the reflexes of a system trained to classify anything ambiguous to avoid acknowledging failures of any kind, applied to the Dyatlov case as they applied to everything else, and the result was that a tragedy that might have been processed and mourned and archived was instead frozen in the amber of official uncertainty, preserved by its own unexplainability, and handed to the future as a problem that each new generation would try and fail to solve. The last thing to say about the Dyatlov case before we let it rest is this. The 9 people who died on the slope of Kholat Syakhl were not victims in the passive sense that the word sometimes implies. They were active, capable, trained people who responded to whatever happened to them with the full force of their skills and their determination. They did not simply lie down in the cold and wait to die. They cut their way out of their tent and moved through the night toward the tree line. They climbed a tree. They built a fire. They turned back toward the tent. They took clothing from the dead and sheltered together. They did everything that their training and their instinct for survival told them to do, and they did it in conditions of extreme cold and darkness and whatever additional terror the night had produced. The fact that none of it was enough is a measure of the severity of what they were facing, not of any failure on their part. They were 9 people who tried everything and lost anyway, and the mountain that defeated them has the same quality of implacable, impersonal finality that all mountain deaths have. It was not trying to kill them, it simply could not be survived. There is a specific kind of forensic reconstruction that investigators applied to the Dyatlov case in the years after the original Soviet files became more accessible, and it is worth walking through some of the more detailed attempts to use the physical evidence to reverse engineer the sequence of events on that night. The most careful reconstructions work from multiple lines of evidence simultaneously: the positions of the bodies, the state of their clothing, the evidence of biological processes in the bodies themselves, the specific physical damage to the tent and its contents, and attempt to build a timeline that is consistent with all of them. No such reconstruction has fully succeeded in achieving that consistency, but the attempts are illuminating in the way that near solutions to a complex problem can be illuminating. They reveal where the difficulty lies, which constraints are hardest to satisfy simultaneously, and therefore which aspects of the evidence are carrying the most diagnostic weight. The bodies found on the slope, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin, were in positions that are consistent with a specific narrative. They were attempting to return to the tent, and they died while doing so. Dyatlov, found highest on the slope and closest to the tent, was lying on his back with his face turned uphill and one arm slightly raised. This posture, face toward the tent, arm in a bracing position, has been interpreted as suggesting a fall forward onto the slope, someone who was walking uphill and then fell forward, lacking the strength to catch themselves, and did not rise again. The arm position is consistent with someone who attempted to break a fall. Kolmogorova, found lower on the slope, was in a posture that suggests she had fallen and then attempted to curl into a protective position, her knees slightly drawn up, her hands near her face. Slobodin, between them in position, was found face down, his hands by his sides. These three positions taken together tell a story of progressive deterioration. People who were still capable of directed movement when they began climbing back toward the tent, who became progressively less capable as they climbed, and who fell when their bodies could no longer maintain the exertion required. The spacing of the bodies, Slobodin closer to the cedar, Kolmogorova closer to the tent, Dyatlov closest, is consistent with the hypothesis that they were ascending together and fell separately as each reached their limit. Whether they were aware of each other's collapses, whether any of them tried to help the others after one fell, cannot be determined. The cold that killed them was not the sudden, dramatic cold of exposure in the open. It was the cold that operates on a body that is still generating some heat through movement, but that is losing heat faster than it can generate it, so that the core temperature drops 1 degree at a time, and each degree makes the next movement harder, until movement becomes impossible. The four in the ravine present a different forensic picture. Their positions, their clothing, and the condition of their bodies all indicate survival for a longer period than the three on the slope, and the practical decisions they apparently made, acquiring the clothing from Doroshenko and Krivonishenko at the Cedar, moving to the sheltered depression of the ravine, staying together, reflect a higher level of functional capability at the point when those decisions were made. The ravine itself would have provided some shelter from the wind, reducing the wind chill that was a major factor in the deaths on the exposed slope, and this shelter might have extended their survival by an hour or two. The injuries to the four have been the subject of biomechanical analysis as well as forensic pathology. The rib fractures of Dubinina and Zolotaryov, multiple ribs broken on both sides in a bilateral symmetric pattern, are particularly significant from a biomechanical perspective. The bilateral, symmetric nature of the fractures is inconsistent with a simple fall, which would typically produce asymmetric injury corresponding to the side of the body that struck the ground. Bilateral rib fractures of this severity are, in modern forensic medicine, most commonly associated with high-energy compressive forces applied to the chest from the front and back simultaneously, the kind of force produced by a car crash, by a chest compression resuscitation attempt, or by a pressure wave from an explosion. Each of these three mechanisms has been proposed by researchers as the cause of the Dyatlov fractures, and each has supporters and detractors in the case literature. The explosion hypothesis, specifically a shock wave from a military device, whether a mine, a rocket component, or some form of experimental weapon, has the advantage of potentially explaining multiple features of the case simultaneously. The sudden, alarming event that drove the group from the tent, the injuries, and the unusual lights in the sky reported by witnesses in the region. It has the disadvantage of requiring a very specific set of circumstances. The explosive device would need to have been at a distance that produced a shock wave strong enough to cause internal injury without producing significant external wounds, and without producing the kind of physical destruction to the campsite and the surrounding terrain that a conventional explosive would leave. No such device has been identified in the Soviet military inventory of the period, though the inventory of Soviet experimental weapons in 1959 is not fully known, even now. The compressed resuscitation hypothesis stated that the chest fractures were produced by vigorous CPR performed by other group members on someone who appeared to have died requires that the resuscitation was performed extremely vigorously, beyond normal first aid protocols, potentially by multiple people pressing on the chest simultaneously, which is not standard procedure. The hypothesis is more plausible for Dubinina, who was the youngest and most vigorous member of the group and whose apparent death would have been most likely to prompt desperate resuscitation attempts, than for Zolotaryov, whose age and wartime experience might have led his companions to accept his death more readily. The bilateral, symmetric nature of the fractures is somewhat inconsistent with a single-person CPR attempt, but could potentially be consistent with a two-person attempt. The forensic complexity of the Dyatlov case is further compounded by the condition of the bodies when they were finally examined. The bodies on the slope, found within days of death in frozen conditions, were relatively well preserved and could be examined with reasonable confidence. The four in the ravine, found after more than 2 months under deep snow in a stream environment, were in a state of partial decomposition that made precise pathological examination significantly more difficult. The 1959 pathologists were working with the technology and methodology of Soviet forensic medicine of the period, which was less refined than modern practice, and their reports are less detailed and less precise than what a modern forensic examination would produce. Some of the most important questions about the injuries, their precise pattern, their sequence, the presence or absence of specific tissue changes that would help distinguish different causative mechanisms, cannot be answered from the 1959 reports alone. This forensic limitation is one of the deep frustrations of the case. The physical evidence that would answer the most important questions is no longer available in a form that modern methods can fully interrogate. The bones of the victims, which were buried in a cemetery in Sverdlovsk after the 1959 investigation, are the most durable physical evidence from the case, and they could in principle be re-examined with modern forensic techniques: CT scanning, biomechanical analysis of fracture patterns, isotopic analysis that could provide information about the conditions at the time of the injuries. Whether such re-examination would be authorized by the Russian authorities and whether it would produce results that resolved any of the case's key questions is not known. The 2018 exhumation of Zolotaryov for DNA testing demonstrated that such procedures are possible in principle. Whether the full forensic re-examination of all 9 cases would be permitted and would be scientifically productive is a different matter. The case has also generated a significant body of psychological and sociological analysis that attempts to understand not just what happened on the mountain, but why the case has generated the sustained attention it has. The psychology of unsolved mysteries in general, why some unsolved cases become cultural phenomena, while others are simply forgotten, is a recognized area of study, and the Dyatlov case has features that make it particularly fertile ground for cultural projection. The youth of the victims, their evident capability and camaraderie, the beautiful and hostile landscape, the Soviet-era secrecy, the specific horror of the injuries, the absence of any clear explanation. These features combine to create a case that operates simultaneously as a genuine historical puzzle, a horror narrative, a Cold War mystery, and a meditation on the limits of human understanding. Each of these registers attracts a different audience, and the case has managed to sustain all of them simultaneously for 65 years. The horror narrative dimension of the case, the version that emphasizes the injuries, the missing tongue, the inexplicable behavior, the suggestion of something deeply strange at work, is the version that attracts the largest popular audience and produces the most cinematically dramatic treatment. It is also the version that does the most damage to the serious investigation of the case because it encourages the selection of evidence that supports dramatic interpretation and the discounting of evidence that supports mundane explanations. The 9 people who died on Dead Mountain deserve to have their deaths taken seriously as a historical problem, not as material for entertainment, and the most respectful treatment of the case is also the most analytically rigorous one, starting from the actual evidence, following it where it leads, and being honest about where it runs out. Following the evidence with that kind of honesty leads to a place that is, in its own way, more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. The place where the evidence runs out, where the question mark stands without a satisfying answer beside it, where 9 specific people with specific faces and specific words in their diaries are simply gone, and the reason for their going is genuinely unknown. This is not the comfortable uncertainty of a mystery that could be solved with more investigation. It is the uncertainty of something that may simply be beyond what can be recovered from 65-year-old evidence, Soviet-era classification, and a mountain that was covered in deep snow when it mattered most. The case may never be solved, not because it is supernatural or beyond the range of physical explanation, but because the window of opportunity for adequate investigation closed in 1959, and what came through that window before it closed was not enough. Let us sit with the landscape one more time before we leave it. The pass is approximately 900 meters above sea level at the point where the ridge drops between Kolatsiakl and the next peak to the north, and from the campsite on the slope you would look eastward into the valley of the Lozva River, the valley the group was trying to reach when they camped. The Lozva is a small river in its upper reaches, by more a stream than a river at the point where the Dyatlov route would have crossed it, and in February it is frozen, its ice surface buried under snow, indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. The forest in the valley is dense by the standards of the open ridge, with birch and fir and pine in the mixture that characterizes the upper taiga of the northern Urals, and it would have been dark even in daylight, the trees standing close together and the snow heavy on their lower branches. At night, from the campsite on the slope, the tree line would have been visible as a darker mass against the slightly less dark sky, a definite edge between the open slope and the forest, the place toward which the footprints led. The night sky over the northern Urals in February, on a clear night, is one of the most extraordinary skies in the inhabited world. The absence of light pollution, as the nearest significant settlement is tens of kilometers away, and the landscape is otherwise empty, means that the stars are visible with a clarity that people living in or near cities have never experienced, and in February the sky runs from Orion Low in the southwest to the winter Milky Way overhead, to the great square of Pegasus setting in the northwest, with the Pleiades near the zenith and Jupiter, and whatever planets are visible at that time, adding their steady, untwinkling light to the general blaze. The northern Urals are far enough north that the aurora is occasionally visible, not with the frequency and drama of the high Arctic, but occasionally in the form of pale green curtains or arcs low on the northern horizon, moving slowly, fading and brightening. Whether the aurora was visible on the night of February 1st, 1959 is not known. The witnesses who reported orange spheres in the sky in that period were not specifically reporting aurora. Their descriptions sound more like discrete objects than like the diffuse luminosity of the northern lights. But the sky over the pass that night would have been, in some configuration, extraordinary, either brilliantly clear and star-filled, or obscured by cloud and blowing snow, with very little middle ground. The group had been photographing the landscape throughout their journey, and the photographs they took capture something of the quality of light and space in this environment. The snow on the open slopes has a particular quality in the photographs: bright when the sun catches it, deeply shadowed in the depressions between the wind-formed sastrugi, with a texture that looks almost three-dimensional in some of the images. The forest in the valley below the slope looks exactly as a forest should look in February in the Urals, dark, dense, the individual trees distinguishable at the edges and blending into a mass toward the center. The group themselves, photographed against this landscape, look small and purposeful. Small because the landscape is genuinely vast, purposeful because these are people who know exactly what they are doing and are doing it with complete commitment. The photographs show a group at work in a landscape that demands everything they have and that they are fully equipped to give. The final photographs taken on the final day, the ones taken by Zolotaryov's camera in the deteriorating light of the late afternoon, have a different quality. The images are darker, less crisp, the light falling in a way that reduces contrast and detail. The people in them are less clearly individual, their faces harder to read, the landscape behind them already taking on the quality of the early dusk that in February at this latitude begins before 4 o'clock and deepens quickly toward the full dark of the long northern night. These images were taken on a day that the group knew would end in a camp on the open slope rather than the sheltered valley. They show people who are tired but not defeated, who are making a reasonable decision within reasonable constraints, who have no reason to believe that the night ahead of them is different from any other night they have camped in difficult conditions. The moment of transition and the moment between the last photograph and the first cut in the tent wall is the moment that cannot be recovered. Everything before it is known in the sense that the group's journey and their state and their competence are documented and understood. Everything after it is known in the sense that the physical evidence of what followed is in the record. The moment itself is gone. What happened in that moment, what specific configuration of physical and psychological circumstances produced the decision to cut open the tent wall and walk out into the February night. This is the knowledge that 65 years of investigation has not been able to reach, and that the mountain on whose slope it occurred has kept without effort, simply by being what it is, rock and snow and wind and the cold that takes everything that stays too long. Consider for a moment the knife. Someone in that tent had a knife. Several of the members carried knives as standard expedition equipment, and someone used that knife to cut through the canvas wall. The act of cutting requires a deliberate, controlled grip and a sustained motion. You do not accidentally cut a tent wall, and you do not cut it in a moment of pure panic in which motor control has been lost. The cuts described in the investigation reports were purposeful. They opened a gap large enough for a person to pass through, and they were made with the kind of controlled force that indicates at least some functional capability in the person making them. This tells us that whoever cut the tent was not immediately incapacitated, was able to grip and move a blade with sufficient control to create a useful exit. It also tells us that the decision had been made, not a vague impulse toward the door, but a specific, committed action on the structure of the shelter itself. Cutting the wall of your tent in a winter storm is not something you do tentatively. It is a declaration. The declaration said, "We cannot stay here. Whatever was outside the tent, cold, wind, darkness, the unknown, was preferable to whatever was inside it or to whatever threat was perceived as bearing on it." The 9 people who passed through that cut and walked down the slope were making a collective judgment that the tent had become untenable, and that judgment, made by 9 experienced mountaineers simultaneously, carries enormous weight. It is not the judgment of one panicking individual, it is the judgment of a group, and groups of experienced people do not collectively abandon shelter in lethal cold without a cause that at the moment of the decision seemed to them sufficient. We do not know what that cause was. We know only the judgment it produced, preserved in the cut canvas, and the footprints, and the terrible arithmetic of what followed. The arithmetic is simple and devastating. 9 people left the tent. 2 died at the cedar tree. 3 died on the slope trying to return. 4 died in the ravine. The mathematics of survival, 0 survivors, is the final fact of the case, the one datum that is not ambiguous or contested or subject to interpretation. Whatever happened that night, it was complete in its outcome. The mountain did not leave anyone to explain it. There is a particular kind of courage in making an expedition into a landscape that makes no accommodation for human frailty, a courage that is different from the courage of battle, where the danger is human and therefore, in some sense, comprehensible and potentially predictable, and different from the courage of illness, where the danger is internal and intimate. The courage of the mountains is the courage of choosing to enter a world that operates entirely by its own rules, that will help you if you know its language and kill you if you make a mistake, and that does not distinguish between people of good character and people of bad, between the capable and the careless, between those who deserve to survive and those who do not. The Northern Urals killed 9 people who deserved to survive. It did this without malice, without meaning, without anything that could be called intention. It simply presented conditions that exceeded what the group, in whatever specific configuration of circumstances that night produced, were able to manage. And the not knowing, the permanent, irreducible not knowing of what those specific circumstances were, is the Dyatlov Pass incident's most enduring feature, the quality that has kept it alive as a question for 65 years and will likely keep it alive for 65 more. Whatever happened in those final hours, whether an avalanche of snow or an avalanche of sound, whether a weapons shockwave or a weather event, whether a panic that began in physics and ended in the cold logic of exposure, whether something that the available categories of explanation do not yet contain. Whatever it was, it took 9 people who had every intention of living, who had plans and families and futures, and it ended them on a slope in the northern Urals in the February dark. The mountain kept its secret through the Soviet Union's rise and fall, through the Cold War and the thaw and the opening of the archives, through 6 decades of investigation by people who cared and who tried and who brought every tool available to them to the problem. The mountain still keeps it. The wind still moves across the slope where the tent was pitched. The tree line is still down there in the dark, the cedar tree still at its edge, and the ravine where 4 of them waited out the night they could not survive is still there, silent and cold, holding nothing that it is willing to give back. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains, after 65 years and hundreds of investigations, one of the most thoroughly documented and most completely unresolved mysteries in the history of outdoor exploration. It resists the explanations offered for it, not because it is inherently supernatural or beyond the reach of physical analysis, but because the evidence it left behind is genuinely complex and genuinely contradictory, because the conditions under which it occurred destroyed some of the most important evidence before it could be properly collected, and because the Soviet system's instinct for secrecy ensured that what was collected was not shared with the people best equipped to analyze it until decades had passed. What remains is 9 people who should have come home and didn't, a tent with cuts in its wall, footprints in old snow that have long since melted, and a question that the Northern Urals have been answering with silence for longer than most of the people now asking it have been alive. Sleep well.